They thought they could auction off a virgin like cattle. But when a silent outlaw rode into town, he didn't come to place a bid. He came to bury the system. In the dry heart of nowhere, where dust clings to your bones and silence weighs heavier than gunpowder, there sat a town most folks rode through and quickly forgot. Dust Creek. They called it a name as forgettable as the lives lived in it. But one day, just one, the whole town held its breath. It wasn't a festival or shootout that brought them to the square, no. This was something worse, something darker, the kind of thing you'd hope only happened in nightmares. Not in daylight, with the sun high and children watching from behind their mothers' skirts. They were auctioning off a girl, a virgin 18, barely grown. Her name was Clara. Folks whispered it like a sin. Clara, the seamstress' daughter. Clara, whose father died chasing gold that never came. Clara, whose mother owed more than she could pay, and in Dust Creek, if you couldn't pay, the law took what it wanted. That law were a tin star and a devil's grin. Sheriff Beckett. Beckett wasn't the kind of man who hid his cruelty. He dressed it up and put it on display, called it order, called it justice. And that day he stood tall on a makeshift stage in the center of town, right beside Clara, like he was proud of what was about to happen. She stood quiet, barefoot, eyes down, wrapped in a dress that once belonged to her mother, but had since been sold, altered, and now reclaimed, threadbare and trembling. Every man in the crowd knew why they were there, but no one said it aloud. They just waited, sweating under the sun, gripping their coins like wolves circling something innocent. Beckett raised his hand and the murmur quieted. The bidding was about to begin. But what none of them knew, not yet, was that someone was coming, a man with no allegiance to law or mercy, a man whose silence spoke louder than bullets. And when he arrived, Dust Creek would never be the same. Clara didn't remember how she got to the stage. One moment she was in her mother's arms, begging her not to sign the papers. The next she was barefoot on rough pine planks, staring at the dirt, surrounded by men who measured women in silver and silence. Her mother had no choice. Sheriff Beckett had seen to that. The debts were real. Fabric bills, medicine, a few coins borrowed after her father's body came back. Wrapped in a miner's coat with no gold inside it, they'd offered to forgive it all in exchange for Clara. Not for marriage, not for work, for ownership one night. Maybe more, however, the buyers saw fit. The townspeople told themselves stories to sleep at night. Told themselves Clara was doing her duty. Told themselves the sheriff was just keeping order. But behind the curtains and bottles and porch railings, most folks were just afraid. Beckett had men, guns, and a grin that promised ruin. So they came to the square not to protest, but to watch. The wooden platform had been used for elections, once speeches, even weddings, but that morning it held Clara, her wrists bound with ribbon to make it look proper, her shoulders bare under the desert sun. She kept her eyes down. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of tears, wouldn't give Beckett the win of seeing her break. He stood beside her like a ringmaster, calling for attention, with a voice that had sentenced men to hang and women to silence. "She's pure," he said loud enough for the buildings to hear, unspoiled, one of a kind. The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't leave either. The merchant spoke first. Harlan Dobb, a man who beat his last wife until she ran into the desert barefoot. He raised a hand, offered a bag of coins. More than most made in a year. Beckett smiled, thanked him, asked if anyone could do better. A rancher stepped forward. Thick hands, thinner soul. He spat in the dirt and said it double. It laughed when Harlan cursed, said Clara had a wildness in her he planned to break. Clara flinched, just barely. Beckett saw it. He liked that. And just as the third hand went up and the heat grew heavy enough to suffocate, someone arrived. A low creak of saddle leather hoofbeats, slow and steady. The kind of entrance that made men shift and women whisper. Dust rose behind him like a warning. No one knew who he was yet. But they would. He didn't look like much at first. Just a tall man on a tired horse riding slow down Main Street like the heat didn't bother him, dressed in a dust-worn coat, wide hat, pulled low, face half shadowed beneath the brim. His boots were cracked, his holster silent, and he wore the look of someone who hadn't smiled in years. No one recognized him, which made him dangerous. Strangers didn't just ride into Dust Creek, not unless they were lost or looking to be found in the worst of ways. But this one didn't ask for directions, didn't look at the signs. He looked at the stage. At her. Clara. The townsfolk turned one by one quiet, as the grave watching him ride straight into the middle of the auction like had been expected. He didn't speak, didn't slow, just tied his horse to the well post and stood there, still as stone. Beckett raised a brow. We got ourselves another bidder? No answer. The man's eyes, cold gray and empty, never left the girl. He walked forward, boots crunching gravel, spurs whispering behind him. And though he hadn't said a word, people stepped aside, some because they were curious, others because they felt it. Something off, something darker than the sheriff, something heavier than the heat. Old man Jeb, the saloon drunk, leaned forward through a cracked shutter and muttered under his breath, "That ain't no ranch hand, that's Cain Maddox." The name dropped like a stone in a well. Cain Maddox, the one who burned a brothel to the ground after they sold a girl, had loved the one who rode alone, spoke only when it mattered, and left blood in his wake when it did the one who had no gang, no badge, no mercy, only perp. And if it really was Cain, then Clara wasn't just a girl on a stage anymore, she was a fuse. And the town was sitting on the powder. Sheriff Beckett didn't rattle easy. Heads stared down outlaws, hanged drifters, broken spirits, and backs alike. But when Cain Maddox looked up at him, just once, Beckett felt something in his gut shift. Not fear, not exactly, but something close, like the feeling right before a rattlesnake bites. Beckett narrowed his eyes. "You planning to bid, stranger? Or just here to watch?" Cain didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, arms loose at his sides, one hand resting near his belt, not on the revolver but close enough to make every man in a 10-foot radius sweat. His silence wasn't defiance, it was declaration. The crowd shifted uneasily. The merchant barked, "If he ain't speaking, he ain't bidding, get him out of here. Ain't no room for vagrants in a lawful auction." Lawful, that word burned in Cain's ears like gunpowder. Beckett gave a tight smile. "Has got a right to be here. Same as anyone." Then to Cain he added, "But if you're looking to buy, speak your piece, girl, don't come cheap use." Cain took one slow step forward. The kind of step you take when you're not afraid of anything. Not bullets, not death, not even God. Then another. The crowd parted and a hush fell so thick it seemed to choke the wind. No one breathed. No one dared speak. Cain reached into his coat. Fingers moved. Slow, deliberate. Sheriff's hand went to his pistol. Two deputies flinched. But Cain didn't draw iron. He pulled out a single coin, a silver dollar, walked to the edge of the stage, and dropped it at Beckett's boots. The clang echoed through the square like thunder. A mockery. One coin. For a girl you're trying to sell like cattle. It wasn't a bid, it was an insult, a warning, a war drum in disguise. Beckett stared at the coin, then at Cain. Clara looked up for the first time, her eyes locking on the outlaws. What she saw there wasn't pity, wasn't rage, it was a promise, the kind carved in blood and shadow. Something was about to happen, and no one, not Beckett, not the bidders, not even Clara, was ready for it. For a long moment no one moved. Beckett stared at the silver dollar like it had bitten him, his lips twisted. Half sneer, half confusion. He was used to obedience, not mockery, and definitely not in front of a crowd out. He leaned down, picked up the coin, and held it up for all to see. "This what you think she's worth?" he asked Cain loud enough to carry across the square. Cain said nothing. The crowd watched silent and twitchy. A storm was building. They could feel it in their bones. Cain's coin might as well have been a match tossed into dry timber. The sheriff stepped down from the platform, coin still in hand, boots stomping slow and deliberate toward the stranger. He stopped, just a few feet from Cain, close enough to smell dust and dried sweat. "You think this is funny?" Beckett growled, quieter now, voice like a snake sliding through brush. "You walk in here, interrupt my auction, insult the law, and stand there like you don't bleed." Cain didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just looked at Beckett with those dead gray eyes, unmoving, empty, dangerous. The kind of look that didn't beg for conflict. It promised I do. Beckett laughed, but it was hollow. "You don't talk much, huh?" He stepped closer, just inches now, testing the air between them. "Maybe you're slow, maybe you think this girl's worth saving, that it? You her knight. You ride in, throw down a coin, and we all just stop the auction and cheer for the stranger?" Still, nothing. But Cain did move, just his head slight tilt, not back, not fear forward. A challenge. Sheriff Beckett felt a ripple like cold creeping into his boots. He looked around. His deputies were watching. The crowd was watching. And Clara was standing straighter now, as if this outlaw's presence had poured steel into her spine. That didn't sit right with Beckett. He leaned in just enough for only Kane to hear. "I own this town. That girl's mine if you get in my way. You want leave with your hands or your tongue." Then he smiled. But Kane finally spoke. One word. "Try." It was quiet, but it hit like thunder. Beckett froze. And in that instant, something cracked. Something subtle but final, the kind of shift you don't notice until it's too late. Because the moment Kane spoke, the auction stopped being an auction and started being a countdown. After that one word, "try," you could have heard a feather drop on the gallows. The sheriff didn't reply, couldn't, the way Kane said it. It wasn't a threat, it was a prophecy spoken quiet, carved in stone. Beckett stepped back. Not because he wanted to, but because something deep in his spine told him it was the smart thing to do. Kane hadn't reached for his gun. He didn't have to. Every man watching knew what would happen if Beckett made the wrong move. The outlaw wasn't here to bluff. And Clara? She stood taller, now, shoulders squared, chin up. The ribbon on her wrists fluttered in the breeze like a flag raised for help. But now help had arrived. The crowd shifted. Men who were eager to bid now looked unsure. The rancher who offered to break her took one slow step backward. Arlen Dobb pulled his hat down low, trying to disappear. Because something had changed. Not just the auction, the whole town. Kane hadn't drawn his weapon, but had drawn a line not in sand and stone, and everyone saw it. The preacher stepped onto his porch, staring wide-eyed. A boy holding his father's hand whispered, "Pa, is that the man from the stories?" And deep inside the saloon, the piano player stopped playing entirely. Beckett, red with fury and cornered pride, turned on his heel and marched back up to the platform. Biddings closed. He barked, "Anyone who steps forward now is defying the law of Dust Creek." But his voice cracked just a little. And his deputies, they didn't echo the order. They just stood there watching Kane like he was gravity itself. Kane hadn't moved. His hands were still down, his eyes still locked on Clara. And Clara. She looked right back, not at Kane the outlaw, but at something else. Hope. The town didn't know it yet, but this day wouldn't be remembered for the auction. It'd be remembered for who showed up to stop it. Sheriff Beckett stood on the stage like a man still trying to convince himself he was in control. He scanned the crowd. Faces that once bowed to him now refused to meet his eyes. Men who once laughed at his jokes now stayed quiet. His deputies? Still silent. One wiped sweat from his neck and looked toward the saloon door like maybe it was time to take a long lunch. And in front of all of them stood Kane Maddox. He hadn't moved, not an inch. He didn't need to. The man wore stillness like a second skin. Weaponized it. No badge, no posse, just presence. You could feel it in your ribs. Beckett cleared his throat, then tried again, louder this time. "This here is lawful trade," he said. "The girl owes debts. Her mama signed the contract. If any man's got a problem with that, they can take it up with the court." "Court?" A voice from the back called out, "We ain't had a judge here since before the drought." Someone laughed, then two more. And that was the worst sound Beckett could have heard. Laughter, the one thing he couldn't hang. He slammed a fist on the wooden rail. This ain't a joke. But it was too late. The illusion had cracked. What Kane hadn't said in words, the town said in silence. And now in chuckles. Beckett was just a man, a loud one. And men can bleed. Kane took one step forward, just one. It echoed. The sheriff's hand went to his pistol, but he didn't draw, not yet. He just gripped it like a coward grips a prayer. Tight, trembling, and too late. "You want her?" Beckett's snarled teeth showing now. "You pay not in coins, not in looks, with blood you draw right now." Kane said nothing. Instead he looked up at Clara, still tied, still standing tall, and then glanced at her wrist, the ribbon soft, white, fragile. And in one smooth, wordless motion, Kane stepped onto the stage. The crowd gasped. No one stopped him, not even Beckett. Kane walked past the sheriff like he wasn't even there. Clara didn't flinch. She just looked up at him, eyes wide, but not in fear. Kane reached into his coat again, and for a moment everyone braced, but he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a knife. Then, slowly, carefully, he cut the ribbon. It fluttered to the boards like a feather in a storm. Clara's hands were free. And the town? It wasn't Beckett's anymore. Kane cut the last of Clara's bindings. And for a beat the world seemed to pause. Clara stared at her hands. Red, raw but free, she looked at Kane, at his face, at the silence that clung to him like a shadow. And something in her memory stirred that jaw, that scar near his temple, those eyes. Gray like ash on a battlefield. She whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "I know you." Kane didn't answer, didn't need to. Because 10 years ago Clara had been just a girl playing outside the miners' tents on the edge of Riverbend. A boy used to sneak her pieces of hard candy when no one was looking, taught her how to shoot with a slingshot, gave her his coat when the frost came early. Then he vanished after the fire. After the screaming, the town never spoke of what happened at Riverbend. Only that it burned, only that one family didn't make it out, but one boy did. He disappeared into the hills, and when he came back years later, they called him Kane Maddox. Now here he stood in front of her again. No longer a boy, a man shaped by fire and silence, and she wasn't a child anymore either. Down below, Sheriff Beckett had had enough. "You think this little reunion means a damn thing?" He barked. "You think this girl's walking away because you snipped a bow?" Kane turned, stepped off the platform, and stared. For the first time, the outlaw spoke at length, and the crowd leaned in to hear it. "I watched your kind burn a town to the ground. Sold women for whiskey, hanged a father for protecting his daughter. You think I forgot?" Beckett didn't flinch, but his skin had gone pale. Kane kept walking. "This ain't just about her. This is about what you were." Beckett reached for his pistol. Kane didn't. He just said, "Draw," and the street held its breath because every soul in Dust Creek knew. This wasn't about a girl anymore. This was about ghosts, and one of them had just come home. Sheriff Beckett's hand twitched over his holster. One word had set it off. "Draw." Kane didn't shout it, didn't bark it like Beckett had all day. He said it like it had already happened. Like the bullet was already flying, like fate had already written the ending. And he was just giving Beckett a chance to catch up. The crowd scattered instantly. Children were pulled behind barrels. Men dove into doorways. The saloon doors flapped as folks ducked for cover. Even the preacher ducked behind his cross, and the street emptied, except for 2 men, Beckett and Kane. Sheriff Beckett hesitated just a blink, but it was enough for Kane to step forward. Beckett's fingers fumbled at his side. Too fast, too sloppy, too scared. He hadn't drawn in years, hadn't needed to, not when fear did the job for him. But fear doesn't stop bullets. Kane's hand moved like water over stone, steel cleared leather, and then crack, a single shot, not 2-1. The echo rolled down Main Street like thunder off canyon walls. And when the dust settled, Sheriff Beckett was on his knees, eyes wide, hand frozen around the grip of his still holstered gun. Blood spilled slow down his coat, blooming like a cursed flower from the center of his chest. He tried to speak, failed. Kane stepped close, knelt, whispered, "Justice don't always wear a badge," then stood and walked away. Beckett fell forward face first into the dirt he used to rule. And just like that, Dust Creek had no sheriff. The silence afterward wasn't fear, it was release. The spell had broken, the chain had snapped, and Kane didn't look back, not once. Kane didn't rush. He walked back toward the platform like the dust itself stepped aside for him. His boots hit the wood where Clara still stood untied, free, and unsure what to do with that freedom. Beckett's body lay in the dirt behind him, and the town was watching, silent, stunned, and changed. Clara looked down at her torn dress, her bruised wrists, the ribbon lying useless at her feet. Then up at Kane, the man who'd ended it all with a single bullet. "Why?" she whispered. Kane stared at her a long while, not like she was fragile. Not like she was broken, but like she was something he almost forgot existed. "Hope," he finally spoke, "because someone should have stopped them a long time ago." Clara swallowed hard. "But why me? You don't even know me." Kane's jaw tightened. "I knew enough. You didn't scream. You didn't cry. You stood tall. Even when the whole town watched you fall." That hit her deeper than any kindness ever had. Clara didn't cry, not yet. She could. Her body didn't know how to process freedom. It was like waking up from a nightmare and realizing you were still alive. The townsfolk began creeping back out. The saloon doors creaked open. The banker peeked from his window. A child ran to retrieve a ball that had rolled across the street during the gunfire. No one cheered, no one clapped, because sometimes justice doesn't wear a smile, it just leaves space. And in that space Kane turned to Clara and held out his hand, not to carry her, not to lead her, to let her decide. Clara looked at it, then at the road stretching out behind Kane's silhouette. She took a breath, then another, and put her hand in his. Not because she needed saving, because she was ready to walk. Kane and Clara walked side by side down the street, slow, quiet, like they were stepping out of a war zone. The townsfolk watched from windows, porches, behind wagons. No one stopped them, no one dared. Beckett's body still lay in the dirt. No one rushed to move it. Even his deputies had disappeared, melted into back alleys and side doors the moment his blood hit the street. But Kane wasn't celebrating. He could feel it in the air. The rot hadn't come from just one man. As they passed the saloon, the doors creaked open. The piano player stood there, face pale. "Hey," he said to Kane, voice low. "You think that was the end?" Kane paused. The man looked around, then leaned closer. "There's more than Beckett. He wasn't the one running girls like Clara out to buyers, and Cross Hollow just collected the coin." Kane narrowed his eyes. "Who?" The piano player shook his head. "No names, but he had a partner back east in this." He glanced at Clara. Was supposed to be the last one before the real shipment started. 10 girls younger. Clara stiffened beside Kane. 10. Kane felt something cold settle in his chest. Had thought this was about Clara, about Dust Creek, about ending one man's tyranny. But now he saw it. Beckett was the front door. Someone else was still in the house. He turned to Clara. "You know where they're kept?" She nodded slowly. "I worked the kitchens at the old mill, heard men talking. It's hollow now, but there's a cellar underneath." Kane turned back toward the outskirts of town. The wind picked up again. Same dust, different storm. The old mill sat at the edge of Dust Creek like a broken tooth in a crooked smile, weathered, silent, and rotting from the inside out. Long ago it had been a symbol of growth, back when Dust Creek had dreams, before the mines dried up, before men like Beckett sold hope for profit. Clara led Kane through the back, where the weeds were tall, and the windows shattered. The air smelled of damp wood and oil. She paused near a rusted hatch. "Down there," she said, "I only saw it once, men going and girls not coming back out." Kane knelt, brushed dust from the hatch handle. It was old, but not untouched, fresh boot prints in the grime, and the lock had been broken recently and sloppily replaced. He drew his knife, snapped the latch with a twist, and swung the hatch open. Darkness breathed out like a secret. "Stay here," he told Clara. She didn't move. Kane hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, stay behind me." The stairs groaned under their weight as they descended into blackness. No light, no sound, just the weight of dirt above, and the feeling of something wrong pressing against their ribs. Kane lit a match. The flame danced across the walls, bare stone with markings carved deep, old and angry. Down a narrow corridor, iron cages lined the passage like a mine shaft gone to hell. And inside them, girls. 8 of them. Dirty, starved, mute with fear. They blinked into the light like it was something they hadn't seen in days. Clara gasped and dropped to her knees. "Dear God." Kane moved fast, checking for locks. Most were broken. These girls weren't meant to stay long, just held, then shipped. Clara hugged one of them, a little thing with straw blonde hair and swollen wrists. The girl didn't speak, just leaned into her like a child to a mother she hadn't met yet. Kane turned, scanning the corridor, and spotted something in the corner. A ledger. He picked it up, flipped it open. Names, ages, prices. Next to each a check mark or a red X. It wasn't just Dust Creek. This was part of something larger, organized, paid for track. And at the bottom of the last page, a signature. Harlan Dobb. The banker. Kane's jaw clenched. They thought Beckett was the monster. Had just been the muscle. Kane stood at the edge of that cellar, staring down at the banker's signature, as if it were blood on a church wall. Harlan Dobb. Of course. Always dressed in white, always smelled of mint. And Gold smiled, like he never got his hands dirty. But in Dust Creek, everyone knew if Beckett broke bones, Dobb broke futures. Kane climbed the stairs with a ledger in his coat, and vengeance riding his shoulders like a loaded saddle. Behind him, Clara and the girls emerged into the daylight. Their eyes winced at the sun like it burned. But they were alive, and Kane would make sure they stayed that way. They returned to town, slow, careful. Word was spreading already. Beckett was dead. The outlaw had freed the girl. But no one knew yet what lay under the miller. Kane aimed to change that. He stepped into the center of town and didn't say a word, just tossed the ledger onto the preacher's steps. The book cracked open with a thwack, pages fluttering like guilty whispers. By sundown, folks had read enough. They didn't need a trial. They needed Dob. Kane turned to Clara. You know where hell be. She nodded. He never leaves the bank after sundown, sleeps in the vault room, claims it's safer than any inn. Kane grunted. Only if you ain't got enemies. Clara frowned. What are you going to do? Kane didn't answer right away. Because this wasn't a shootout. It was a reckoning. And Kane knew if he kicked in that door and shot Dob between the eyes, he'd be no better than the system Dob ran. He had to make the whole town see the truth, feel it. So that when justice came, it didn't ride away with the wind. It stayed. He turned to Clara. I'm gonna walk into that vault and take back every soul he locked away, not just the girls, the whole town, one truth at a time. Clara looked at him, fire in her chest now. And for the first time she smiled. The bank sat at the center of Dust Creek like a smug little kingdom. Brick walls barred windows and doors thick enough to stop most bullets, but Kane wasn't bringing bullets. He was bringing truth. Evening cast long shadows across the street as Kane approached. He didn't sneak. He didn't hide. He walked straight through the front door like he was cashing a check. Inside it smelled like paper, ink, and old money. Behind a counter stood Harlan Dob. White waistcoat, silk tie, gold-rimmed glasses. Perched on a hooked nose, he didn't flinch when Kane walked in. He just offered that oily little smile. Well, well, Dob said, voice syrupy. Mr. Maddox, heard you caused quite the stir today. Quite the mess. Actually, sheriff's office is in shambles. Kane didn't smile. He tossed the ledger onto the polished wood. Dob's fingers twitched. He glanced down, saw the open pages, the names, the prices, his signature. Still, he kept that smirk. Ledger's a fake. You know how rumors spread in these parts. Anyone could've written my name in. There's a girl, Kane, said voice low and cold, in the cellar of your mill. With a ribbon still tied around her wrists, she can't read. But she remembers your voice. That shook him. Just a flicker. But Kane saw it like a crack in a porcelain mask. You think you can just walk in here and throw accusations? Dob snapped. I built this town. I lent money when no one else would without me. Dust Creek is just dirt and broken dreams. Kane leaned forward. You didn't build Dust Creek. You bought it one soul at a time. Dob's hand moved toward the drawer beneath the desk. Kane was faster. Not with a gun. This time with the truth. He held up the ledger and turned it toward the open window behind him where townsfolk had begun to gather. You want to shoot me? Kane growled. Do it in front of them. Dob froze. Outside people were pressing against the glass now. Faces, pale mouths tight. The preacher, the grocer, the blacksmith, even one of Beckett's old deputies. Kane slammed the ledger onto the desk again. You branded girls like cattle, sent them east, called it business. Dob swallowed. Kane stepped around the desk. You think locking yourself in a vault makes you untouchable? He said all it does is trap you with your sins. Then Kane reached into his coat and pulled out keys, the ones taken from Beckett's belt, and walked to the back door. Behind it, the vault room. Dob panicked. You can't. You're an outlaw. Kane opened the door. And inside, gold. Piles of it, stolen land deeds, contracts, bonds, and a small cot where Dob had been sleeping atop a kingdom of broken lives. Kane turned to the crowd now standing behind him. This is what your silence paid for, he said. Dob tried to run, but it wasn't Kane who stopped him. It was Clara, standing in the doorway, ribbon still in her hand, now tied like a noose. You remember me? She asked. And Dob didn't speak, because guilt never needs words. The vault room had gone silent. Kane stood in the center, the weight of Dust Creek's sins stacked in gold around him, contracts, ledgers, the twisted crown of a false king. And Dob? He knelt now, not out of choice, but because the townsfolk had finally found their spine. The blacksmith held a rifle across his chest. The preacher stood stone-faced by the door, not praying, watching. Clara kept the ribbon in her hand like a relic of everything she'd survived. She didn't tremble anymore. She stood tall, Clear-eyed, fierce, Kane looked around, his voice calm but hard enough to cut glass. This town let a girl get auctioned. Murmurs rippled, watched it, let it happen. Because you were afraid of men like Beckett and men like him. He nodded toward Dobb. Dobb whimpered. I don't. Kane's stare shut him up cold, he continued. I ain't here to be your sheriff. I'm not your judge. I'm not even your hero, but I'll tell you what I am. He stepped up onto the vault ledge and held the ledger high above his head. I am the reckoning you were too scared to bring. Then he tossed the ledger onto the vault floor, pulled a match from his coat and struck it. The flame danced between his fingers like justice itself asking for permission. Clara stepped forward. Her voice didn't shake. Let it burn. Kane dropped the match. The flames caught quick. Paper, ink, greed. They all went up in seconds. Dobb screamed and tried to lunge for it, but Kane grabbed him by the collar and slammed him back. Smoke began to pour from the windows. The crowd outside didn't panic. They watched. They understood. Something old was dying in Dust Creek. Something rotten. Something long overdue by the time the fire department showed. There was nothing left of the vault but ash and melted brass. And Dobb. He didn't speak a word after that. They say he still sits in his cell upstate whispering about fire and ribbons. Outside the smoldering remains, Clara walked beside Kane. Her hand brushed his. You were leaving, aren't you? Kane nodded. I don't belong in places once they start healing. Clara looked up at him. You sure? Kane looked down the road. Wide, empty and waiting. No, he said, but I've got a feeling you do. She smiled, the kind that made men believe in tomorrow. And Kane? He turned and rode. Dust Creek didn't need him anymore. But somewhere else would. The fire burned down more than a vault that night. It burned down silence. It burned down fear. And when the smoke cleared, Dust Creek stood blinking in the light like a town waking from a long bad dream. They found more than gold in the ashes. They found letters, names of buyers, shipping records, maps, evidence that stretched far beyond one town. But Dust Creek didn't look away this time. They stood tall. For the first time in a long time, they chose to remember. In the days that followed, the townsfolk got to work. The girls rescued from beneath the mill were cared for, fed, clothed, housed. Clara became their guardian, not by law but by something stronger, choice. She reopened the old schoolhouse and turned it into something new. Part home, part haven, part place of learning. The townspeople began showing up with food, blankets, books. One morning the blacksmith arrived with a handmade sign that read, Clara's light, she cried when he hammered it into the ground. As for Kane Maddox, he stayed just long enough to fix the church door Beckett had broken during the auction. Hammered it straight. No fanfare. No one told him to go, but no one expected him to stay either. One morning Clara found him saddling his horse. You really leaving? She asked. Kane gave a slow nod. I didn't come here to stay. Just to set things right. Clara stepped closer. And what if I said things aren't right yet? Kane looked at her. Really looked. You'll make them right, he said. You already are. She reached up, tied the old pink ribbon around his saddle horn. It fluttered in the breeze like a piece of memory that refused to be forgotten. Then, ride careful, she said. Kane tipped his hat. Always. And with that, he turned his horse toward the horizon. Dust Creek watched him go. Some say Kane rode into another town just like it where another girl needed saving. Others say he disappeared for good, became legend. But one thing's certain. In Dust Creek, they never forgot the day a girl was nearly sold and a silent outlaw said no. And from that day forward, when folks told stories by lantern light or whispered old warnings to their children, they always began the same way. They tried to auction off a virgin, but a silent outlaw had other plans.